In the world Ray Stone knew, threats usually announced themselves with velocity and noise. But in this sanitized, suburban bubble known as the Preserve, the true conflict began in silence, hidden behind the brittle veneer of good order. This place promised peace and predictability, but demanded absolute, suffocating conformity. Ray, a U.S. Marshal, was a master of consequence, a specialist in definitive action. Yet, here he was, about to engage in a war against something far smaller, yet infinitely more tedious. Deborah Vance, the self-appointed high priestess of the Homeowners Association. His Porsche, an unrepentant piece of precision engineering, was the visual affront she could not tolerate. It was his declaration of independence. And to Deborah, independence was the only unforgivable sin. The camera angle shifts to the front window. The silent, electric golf cart glides to a halt just off Ray's property line. Deborah Vance is behind the wheel, dressed in an immaculate pink pantsuit. She clutches a laminated clipboard with proprietary fervor. She squints, adjusting her visor, and produces her smartphone. She arrived with the bureaucratic fanaticism of an auditor, armed only with a checklist and a need for dominion. She wasn't just citing violations. She was gathering evidence for a personal vendetta she cloaked in civic responsibility. Every click of that phone camera, every pen stroke on that clipboard, was a conscious, calculated attempt to assert her power. She targeted the aesthetic, the dark frame, the tint, but the real transgression was Ray's refusal to acknowledge her authority as legitimate. Ray watched her, calm. He recognized the pattern of the small tyrant. Identify the most valuable asset, declare it a threat, and then use the system to justify its removal. She wanted the car gone, and she wouldn't stop until she had fabricated the legal leverage to take it. Ray smoothly pushes open his front door and steps onto the stoop. His presence quiet but immediate. Deborah startles slightly, her expression momentarily faltering before snapping back into its mask of professional HAUT. You're Deborah. A question of procedure. Has the board passed a new resolution? I was under the impression that physical documentation for the purpose of fine assessment required a minimum of 3 Level 1 written notices prior to property photography. Raymond, you know perfectly well I'm performing a standard aesthetic compliance audit. This isn't photography. It's mandated documentation, and I'm quite certain Section 4C allows for preliminary visual evidence upon first observation of an egregious aesthetic violation. The tinted windows, Raymond, and that frame on your license plate. It is an unauthorized alteration, violating code for .b.ii, and your rear wheel is clearly encroaching on the common lawn area. That is a liability. The wheel is on my driveway. The asphalt is cracking there, a structural failure the HOA is responsible for, and I park to avoid it. And the frame is a simple holder for the state-issued plate. It is not an alteration to the vehicle itself. Where is the written notice for this supposed Level 1 violation? It's being processed now. Consider this your required verbal warning, followed immediately by the Level 1 notice, which will be posted to your mailbox by 10 a.m. We value conformity. Raymond, compliance is mandatory. It's what keeps our property values stable. Without another word, Deborah pivots, starts her golf cart, and glides away. The faint, electric whir sounding annoyingly arrogant. Ray walks to his mailbox and peels off the freshly affixed violation notice. It is brightly colored and absurdly detailed. He crushes it in his hand, then deliberately smooths it out before carrying it inside. He places it neatly on his kitchen counter beside his coffee cup. He takes a deep breath. Ray knew the system. Level 1, a notice. Level 2, a fine. Level 3, a mandatory hearing. But he also knew Deborah. She wouldn't wait for the process. She had a target, and she had an obsession. He crossed the kitchen to his laptop, opening a window to the HOA's bylaws, followed by a separate window for county property and court records. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was an escalating attack on his peace, conducted by an adversary who believed her position granted her immunity. Ray didn't feel anger. He felt a weary, clinical resolve. He was no longer a resident arguing a bylaw. He was a marshal, observing a potential criminal conspiracy forming in his own neighborhood. The game had just changed. He would let her think she was winning. He would let her make the inevitable, criminal mistake. For Marshal Ray Stone, the world was divided into problems that required lethal force and problems that required only a stamp and a certified letter. He was juggling the pursuit of a genuinely dangerous man with the persistent, paper-based assault of a neighborhood bureaucrat. The level to notice, with its arbitrary fine, was not an attempt at compliance. It was a deliberate provocation. Deborah Vance wanted surrender, and she was applying pressure, expecting him to crack under the monotonous weight of her paperwork. But Ray was not wired to fold. He was wired to analyze the attack, identify the weakness, and prepare a counter-move. He spent hours cross-referencing the HOA's bylaws with local municipal and federal statutes, establishing the exact, precise line where Deborah's petty power ended and where actual criminal jurisdiction began. He knew she was building to a singular, dramatic move, and he intended to give her the stage to perform it. The shift from bureaucratic harassment to criminal intent is a subtle one, often marked by the simple act of surveillance. When Deborah's game moved from finding his property to physically observing it under the cover of darkness, Ray recognized the tactical change. She was no longer seeking a rule to enforce. She was seeking a way to physically remove his car, to strike at the single largest, most visible symbol of his independence. This wasn't about the lawn. It was about grand theft under the guise of HOA authority. She was looking for muscle, a contractor willing to bend the law for cash. Ray immediately implemented his own countermeasures, installing hidden cameras and ensuring the Porsche was ready to move, yet completely exposed. He wasn't waiting for the threat to arrive. He was baiting the trap. He would let the amateur criminals arrive, and then he would introduce them to professional consequence. In law enforcement, we know that criminals are rarely original. When someone requires a crime to look official, they borrow the uniform. Deborah didn't hire tow truck drivers. She hired actors, low-rent operators, desperate enough to attempt a felony under the ridiculous premise of an HOA directive. Their performance was weak, the uniforms ill-fitting, the demeanor overly aggressive, the equipment cheap. They were a budget production of fraud. But the intent was clear: theft under the false pretense of authority. Marshal Stone, observing from a distance, calculated the situation. No visible firearms, minimal professionalism. It wasn't a lethal threat. It was a calculated, civilian crime in progress. The moment the first fake cop placed a hand on his vehicle, the crime was initiated, and the trap was sprung. Authority is not a costume. It is a certainty of action. The fake cops, having based their entire move on a lie, instantly collapsed when faced with the truth. Their petty attempt at theft collided with the full, cold weight of federal jurisdiction. The game ended the moment Ray's badge, the symbol of legitimate, federal power, was displayed. He had not lost his temper. He had simply enforced the law. The immediate fear and surrender of the criminals validated the choice Ray had made to let them commit the felony. And across the street, Deborah Vance, watching her entire desperate, pathetic plan unravel, learned the absolute difference between a homeowners association mandate and a federal grand theft conspiracy. The consequence she was so eager to deal to Ray was now squarely hers. The illusion of authority, once shattered, reveals only weakness. The two men, initially so eager to play the part of law enforcement, crumbled under the cold, professional glare of actual law enforcement. Ray's call had been concise: federal marshal, apprehending individuals impersonating officers, attempting grand theft auto under false pretenses. The local response was immediate. The fake cops, their bravado evaporating, quickly confessed under interrogation. They were small-time opportunists, paid a paltry sum by Deborah Vance for what they believed was a simple, unofficial repossession. The details of the conspiracy spilled out: the payment, the fabricated story of HOA authority, the absolute lack of any legal documentation. They implicated Deborah directly, providing the final, incontrovertible piece of the puzzle. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial. It was sitting on the curb, detailing a clear conspiracy to commit a felony. Ray walks over to the fake cops, his expression unreadable. He kneels down, bringing himself to their eye level. "Look at me. What exactly did she tell you to do? And for how much? She said it was an HOA matter, unapproved vehicle, on restricted property. Said she had the full backing of the board, just to repossess it quietly. $500 each, up front, for handling fees. We swear, we didn't know you were federal. $500 to commit a felony. Interesting. Did she mention what would happen if someone else showed up? Someone legitimate? No, sir. Just said to be discreet. She was watching. Said she'd handle any complaints. Said she owned the neighborhood. Ray stands up, signaling to one of the local officers. These to have provided full statements. Officer. Their payment and specific instructions came directly from Ms. Deborah Vance, HOA President, residing across the street. This isn't just impersonation. It's a clear conspiracy to commit grand theft auto. Federal jurisdiction might have something to say about that. The local officer nods, a grim look on his face. He turns and heads toward Deborah's house. For years, Deborah Vance had operated on the illusion that her rules and her perceived status were impenetrable. She believed her position as HOA President granted her immunity, allowing her to manipulate the law to satisfy her personal vendettas. That morning, she learned the stark difference between a petty HOA mandate and the full, crushing weight of federal attention. Her perfect kingdom was collapsing, not because of a technicality, but because of a simple, undeniable criminal act, conspiracy to commit grand theft auto, coupled with the hiring of individuals to impersonate officers. The irony was brutal. Her obsession with a minor rule had resulted in her violating major law. The system, once manipulated, always rights itself, often with devastating efficiency. The scene unfolded for all to see. Neighbors, initially drawn by the flashing lights, now emerged from their homes, watching. There was no outrage, no sympathy for Deborah. Instead, they were quiet nods, whispered conversations, and subtle smiles. One neighbor even offered Ray a discreet thumbs up. The collective sigh of relief in the preserve was palpable. Ray Stone had done more than save his car. He had exposed a bully and, in doing so, restored a fragile balance. He climbed back into his Porsche, his mission here complete. The immediate consequences for Deborah were swift and severe. Charges would be filed, legal battles would ensue, and her carefully constructed life would unravel. But the deeper, more profound consequence was the loss of her power, her respect, and her standing in the community she so desperately sought to control. She was no longer the queen of the preserve. She was its pariah. The legal mechanism, once engaged, moves with an indifferent finality. Deborah Vance, the self-proclaimed administrator of petty laws, would now face laws that carried significant weight. The fake cops, having confessed to accepting payment for a crime, faced serious time for impersonation, a charge that, when combined with grand theft conspiracy, ensured their amateur scheme would have a very professional consequence. The entire affair was a study in irony. An HOA president's obsession with a minor parking rule ended with her violating multiple major felonies. Ray Stone, having witnessed the legal system work both on the grand scale of fugitive recovery and the ridiculous scale of neighborhood feuds, knew the true power of law was its indifference to social status. It treated a fugitive trying to escape the country the same way it treated an HOA president trying to steal a car as a violation that demanded accountability. He had spent years establishing the fundamental truth that authority is not granted by self-assertion, but by due process and legitimate training. Deborah's failure was born of her certainty that her money and her title could purchase that authority. Ray had merely offered a definitive, costly lesson that the badge and the uniform, the real ones, were not for sale, nor were they to be mocked. The paperwork was complete. The consequences were delivered. His part in the neighborhood drama was concluded. The marshal was back on the road. The domestic skirmish, the small war of wills fought over an inch of lawn and a piece of aluminum, was over. The silence he had sought in the preserve had returned, purchased not by compliance, but by the enforcement of true justice. The message was clear, not just for the remnants of the HOA board, but for anyone who believes a thin sliver of authority, whether a title, a uniform, or a rulebook, grants them the right to violate another's peace, Power demands respect, and respect is earned through legitimate, measured action, not through petty tyranny. When you confuse the two, when you decide that a minor slight justifies a major crime, you risk colliding with the quiet certainty of those who enforce the actual law. Ray Stone had defended his property? Yes, but more importantly, he had drawn a hard, professional line between bureaucracy and felony. He left behind a neighborhood humbled, a bully punished, and a car that was perfectly, legally parked. Know your limits, and absolutely, know who you're messing with.